This presentation is about editing grammar. First of all, grammar deals with the placement of words in a sentence and whether or not it is coherent with basic functions of how the language works. So grammar has to deal with the syntax or arrangement of the words and whether or not there is agreement or illogic to the way that they're placed. To condense what is a large concept and the different issues that go with it, if you imagine the Chicago Manual of Styles, Chapter 5 deals with grammar in about 250 paragraphs, and it's quite dense. But let's condense it into three major issues when editing grammar. Editing sentence fragments, editing modifier placement, and editing subject-verb agreement. These three are the major issues we'll deal with. Sentence fragments are sentences that lack a complete structure. This will take you back a bit if it's been a while since considering the parts of a sentence, but sentences consist of two parts for them to be complete: a subject and a verb. And the subject is usually a noun phrase like the dog or a small business. And then the verb is obviously some sort of action. The subject does the action. Sometimes fragments occur because somebody is using a phrase and it's being used as a sentence when actually it's a fragment, it's incomplete. So the way that you edit it is by repunctuating the issue as part of another sentence, or you could add elements to make the phrase complete. Let's look at an example. The fragment: we should encourage employee participation in cost control. For example, an award for the best money-saving idea. The fragment is an award for the best money-saving idea. The reason is this part is just a noun phrase, an award. So we could repunctuate it to correct the error. For example, putting a colon and then including that noun phrase. Or we could do something else. We could add elements to make the phrase complete. For example, we could give, where the subject we has an action, give, and the award is the object of that action. So it makes it a complete sentence. These are two ways to edit fragments that consist of phrases, like a noun phrase, for example, an award. Sometimes fragments occur because somebody has made a dependent clause and treated it as though it's independent. Now, dependent clauses contain a noun phrase, as we just learned, and some sort of verb, and it begins with a subordinating conjunction. Now, some of that's a little bit technical language, but here are examples of subordinating conjunctions. Because, if, since, they sort of communicate cause and effect. After, as long as soon as, before, once, until, when. These communicate some idea of timing or sequence or chronology. As, or just as, communicate some sort of comparison. Although, despite the fact that, even though, in spite of the fact that, though, while, whereas, communicate some sort of contrast in the logic of the sentence. The issue is that some people will have a dependent clause which begins with one of these words that we call subordinating conjunction, and they'll treat that dependent clause as a complete sentence when it is not. So the way to edit it is to join them by using correct punctuation, or end the independent clause and start a new one. Student retention rate has risen, although new student enrollment has declined. And I think even in the way I intoned that those sentences or fragments already communicate some sense of incompleteness in the second part, although new student enrollment has declined. The second part is a dependent clause. It starts with a subordinating conjunction, although it has a noun phrase, student enrollment, and it has some sort of verb form, has declined. But it's incomplete. It lacks a complete structure of a subject and a verb. So we could combine the two by using appropriate punctuation. Some fragments occur when we punctuate a present participle clause as its own sentence. Again, more technical language. So to define it, a present participle clause is a noun phrase that's followed by an ing verb. You can edit it by repunctuating it as another sentence, or add elements to make the clause a complete sentence. Let's look at an example. Each program makes different use of the input device, some uses being more logical than others. What we have here is a fragment in the second part, because the second part is a present participle clause. It has a noun phrase, uses, followed by an ing verb form, being. We could repunctuate it, added a comma, some uses being more logical than others. The new software has several advantages, one of those being the ability to target specific groups. There again, the second part is a fragment. It's a present participle clause because it has a noun phrase, one of those, followed by an ing verb form, being. We could add elements to make it complete. The new software has several advantages. New sentence. One of those is the ability to target specific groups. So we got rid of the being and changed into another form of that verb, is. Two complete sentences, correcting the fragment that consisted of a present participle clause. Sometimes fragments occur because we punctuated a relative clause as its own sentence. Again, technical language. What is a relative clause? A relative clause contains a relative pronoun, who, whom, which, that, followed by some sort of noun or verb form. So the way to edit it is by replacing that relative pronoun with another pronoun or noun phrase, or join the clause to the preceding sentence. Let's look at examples. The company hired a number of employees who may be laid off after the merger. Obviously, the second part is a fragment. It's incomplete in its structure. It's a fragment that has a relative clause in it. The second part begins with the relative pronoun, who, followed by a verb form, be. We could add elements to make it a complete sentence. The company hired a number of employees. They may be laid off after the merger. So we changed that who relative pronoun to another pronoun, period, they. Or we could have just as easily changed that who to a noun, such as the employees may be laid off after the merger. But it makes sense to use the pronoun they so that we don't repeat the word employees, which of course is the function of pronouns, to avoid repeating the same noun again and again. Another example of a fragment consisting of a relative clause. The meeting will be simulcast from the Twin Cities, which will allow viewers in Duluth to watch. The second part, of course, is a fragment, and specifically it's a relative clause. It begins with the relative pronoun, which, followed by a verb form, allow. We could join it to the independent clause. The meeting will be simulcast from the Twin Cities, which will allow viewers in Duluth to watch, using appropriate punctuation, of course. Some fragments occur from punctuating an indirect question as its own sentence. An indirect question begins with the WH word, who, what, where, when, how, immediately followed by a noun. So there are a few ways to correct or edit this. Join the indirect question to the preceding sentence with a colon or em dash. Make the indirect question the object of a verb or preposition. Or change the indirect question to a direct question by placing the first auxiliary verb after the WH item. Now that's a little technical, so let's look at examples. The task force should recommend recycling procedures. In particular, what steps we can take to reduce paper waste. Now just by the intonation you could tell the second part is a fragment. It's incomplete, but it's a particular type of fragment. It's an indirect question. It begins with the WH word, what, followed immediately by a noun, steps. We could join it to the independent clause, make it the object of the verb, or make it a direct question. So here are a few ways, there at the bottom. The task force should recommend recycling procedures. In particular, what steps we can take to reduce paper waste. So we joined it. The task force should recommend recycling procedures. In particular, we need to know what steps we can take to reduce paper waste. So we changed it to an independent question, or a sentence. The task force should recommend recycling procedures. In particular, what steps can we take to reduce paper waste? So we changed it to a direct question, and it's in its own sentence. So those are 3 ways to edit fragments that consist of indirect questions. Now a second category of grammar issue is modifiers. Now what's a modifier? A modifier is a word, a phrase, or a clause that gives more information about another item in the sentence. It modifies it. It changes its meaning somewhat by giving more information about it. This would make sense. Adjectives are typical modifiers. They give more information about a noun. A small dog gives you information about that dog just as much as a big dog gives you more information about that dog. It modifies it. It could be a word, a phrase, or an entire clause. Sometimes the modifiers are ambiguous. That is to say, we don't know what it goes with or what it modifies. Edit them by placing it closer to what they modify. This is ambiguous. We would like to talk to you about starting a new job next month. Okay, next month is a modifier. It's adverbial because it tells us when. The modifier next month could modify a couple of verbs. It could modify starting. It could modify talk. We need to place it next to the verb that it modifies. We would like to talk to you next month about starting a new job. In that case, it's clear that it's modifying talk. We would like to talk to you about a new job that starts next month. In this case, it's easier to see that the job itself starts next month. In any case, we need to understand the meaning or the intent of what the writer was trying to accomplish, and as a consequence, place that modifier closer to what it modifies. It's ambiguous because we were unsure, so let's make it unambiguous. Here are a couple ways to do it. Now, some modifiers are dangling. You may have heard of dangling modifiers. Chicago sometimes calls them danglers also. The reason they're dangling is because it's unclear what it goes with, again, and because it fits two conditions. The sentence begins with an introductory phrase containing a present participle. Remember, a present participle is an ing verb, or it has some other verb form with no phrase in front of it. And the subject of the main clause is not logically the agent or doer of that verb. So, introduce an agent of that verb in the introductory phrase, or make the agent the subject of the main clause. Now, this is a little technical, I would imagine you thinking, so let's look at examples. While inspecting the plant, several safety violations were noted. Now, here's why it's a dangler. While inspecting the plant, and then the subject of the main clause is violations. Now, violations do not logically inspect plants, so this is illogical. In the introductory phrase, while inspecting the plant, it begins with an ing verb, right? Inspecting. And it has no noun phrase in front of it. Also, the subject of the main clause, violations, is not the logical doer of that verb. So there are a couple of ways to edit it. We can introduce an agent of the ing verb in that introductory phrase, or we can make the subject of the main clause the doer of that verb. So let's look at how that might turn out. There at the bottom. While OSHA officials were inspecting the plant, so what we did there was we introduced a doer of the ing verb in the introductory phrase. They noted several safety violations. Or, while inspecting the plant, OSHA officials noted several safety violations. In this edit, we made the subject of the main clause the doer of the verb inspecting. OSHA officials can inspect plants, but as with the original sentence, violations cannot inspect plants. Some modifiers are stacked. That means they're put together in front of an adjective. And they serve to tell you when, or they modify a noun and such that they're adjectives. Edit them by placing some of them after the noun it modifies. So let's look at an example. The small business expansion forecast does not look promising. Some technical writers can get very uppity about stacked modifiers. They really want to avoid them at all costs because they do sometimes propose some ambiguity or confusion. So the stacked business expansion is a stacked modifier of forecast. 3 items modifying forecast. So they're stacked. Small business expansion creates a problem because the reader may not know which of the nouns, business, expansion, forecast, is actually the subject of the sentence, and which are the ones that are the modifiers. Now, you could probably think for a moment about what that meaning of the sentence might be, but what we don't want is for readers to have to take that moment to figure out what's going on with the text. As as you will expect, technical editors are trying to avoid causing the reader to pause and consider meaning as much as they possibly can by being better writers and thus needing the expertise of editors. So here's what we could do. We could place some of the modifiers after the noun it's meant to modify. The expansion forecast for small businesses does not look promising. So yes, small business expansion forecast worked okay, but in this sense, what we're really trying to focus on is that the forecast we're talking about is an expansion forecast, and it so happens to be for small businesses. But maybe those modifiers are less important in what we're trying to communicate, so we put it after the noun forecast. Sometimes modifiers just cause wordiness, or they are redundant. They repeat the meaning. Edit them by placing some of the modifiers after the noun it modifies. 2 pipes, 6 feet in length, feed the coolant into the reactor. Now this is not a horribly written sentence, but there's some redundancy there. In length. Why is that redundant? Why does it just repeat the meaning? Because we already know that when we give a unit of measurement, 6 feet, we're talking about length. We could cut and condense it by just saying 2 6-foot-long pipes feed the coolant into the reactor. So we rearranged some things there in that edit, but also we got rid of the phrase in length. The last category of grammar issues is when the subject and the verb don't agree. A subject and a verb agree if the verb form reflects the number of the subject, singular or plural. Obviously, when they don't reflect that, it's a subject-verb agreement issue that needs to be corrected. Some errors in subject-verb agreement typically come 4 main categories. Sometimes the subject contains a prepositional phrase, like to the door, to the store, above the dog, and so forth. It has a preposition and it has some language after it, typically a noun, and so it's a prepositional phrase. Subject containing a relative clause, again remember who, which, that, whom are relative pronouns, and then there's a noun after it, so that's a relative clause. Sometimes they contain coordinated items, meaning Bob and Larry or whatever. And sometimes they contain other elements. So the subject has this extra information in it, and as a result of that extra information, writers sometimes make the mistake of creating a subject-verb agreement issue or error, and so this needs to be edited. The way to do that is to locate the actual subject of the sentence, locate what the subject is doing, and then make the subject and the verb agree in number. So, as mentioned, sometimes subjects contain a prepositional phrase. The essays in this newly published book supports our claim. Now, the issue here is that the subject is actually essays, and it contains a prepositional phrase in this newly published book, which makes some writers want to make the verb support agree with the nearest noun next to it, which is what? Book. So we need to look for the actual subject of the sentence, which, as we noted, is essays. And the actual verb of the sentence is supports. And so we need to make those agree. The essays support. But you can see why this is a common issue, because there's some extra information in the subject, and in this case the extra information is a prepositional phrase. Sometimes the subject contains a relative clause. Example, the essays that will appear in her next book supports our claim. Now, what's the actual subject of the sentence? What's the actual verb? What does the subject contain? A relative clause, as you could guess from the title of this slide, but what is that relative clause? There's the error. Book and supports don't agree, are not the actual issues at work here. That's not the subject of the sentence. The actual subject of the sentence is essays, and it contains a relative clause that will appear in her next book. Now remember, relative clauses have relative pronouns, that, and some sort of verb or noun form after it, that will appear, which makes some writers want to make the verb support agree with the nearest noun, which is book. So we need to make the subject and the verb agree. So if the actual subject is essays, the verb support needs to agree with it. You can sense again why that would be a common error. There's extra information between the actual subject and the actual verb. Sometimes the subject contains coordinated items. Neither the manager nor the client were informed. The client were. Now, this is an issue where we have to memorize a few things and some basic rules, but once memorized, you'll be able to catch it. Now, the subject of the sentence are two, the manager and the client. And yes, there are two of them, but we need to make the verb that's next to it agree with the closest noun. So here we have it, neither the manager nor the client was informed. So one trick there is to just look at the closest noun and make those agree, which is actually the opposite of the previous rules. So let's look at a table that breaks it down a little bit. When the coordinated items are singular and singular, you want to make a singular verb, was. If it's singular in the first case and then plural in the next case, you want to make it plural because it's close to clients. Were informed. Clients were informed. If both are plural, managers, clients, again, make them plural. Were informed. If it's plural and then singular, what do? Was informed. Now the trick, of course, is in all four of these cases, you're basically looking at the second item in that coordinated subject. The second item communicates what the verb should be like. Sometimes the subject has other sorts of items in it, some other sorts of information. For example, it might take an errand, it might have a gerund in it. What we get from that is there will be a faulty fragmented or subject-verb agreement issue. Meeting with clients were the account executive's responsibility. Now, the reason the writer wants to put that as a plural verb is because clients is right next to it, but actually the subject is not clients. What is the subject? It's meeting. Gerunds, again, are ing verbs that function as nouns. Meeting with clients was the account's executive's responsibility. It's the action, the doing of meeting that's the subject of the verb of the sentence, and so that is only one action or one doer, so it needs to be a singular verb. A little tricky, but really what we get at is we need to find what the actual subject is. It's not clients. Some titles are plural but are really only one thing, and that makes sense. So the trick I have for myself is I think, well, yeah, that's the title of a book or a report or whatever, but there's only one report, there's only one book, so the title itself is not cueing me as to what the verb should be like. Teaching tips contain an article about design homework assignments. Well, it's not the tips that's the subject, it's actually the book itself. Teaching tips contains an article about designing homework assignments. So what we get here is I have to tell myself to think, well, it's actually a book. It's one thing. It doesn't matter if the title is many things. Sometimes we're dealing with units of measurement. If the subject is a unit of measurement with a singular complement, use a singular verb. So, given his record, $10,000 are a reasonable line of credit. We need to think of that money, that unit, as one thing, not as many things. We're not talking about the individual dollars, we're talking about the whole sum. Given his record, $10,000 is a reasonable line of credit. Sometimes the subject contains an expletive, which we'll talk about more later in the course. Basically, an expletive is a verb is a word like there, or there is, there are. This is an expletive. We'll talk about later how that causes wordiness, but one thing that happens often is that there will be subject-verb agreement issues. There is problems with this proposal. The verb needs to agree with the noun phrase, not there, even though that sounds like one thing. There are problems with this proposal. So that's editing grammar.